Welcome to Recovery Corner, where the many pathways of recovery intersect. This is a space where you will hear personal stories of triumph in recovery, gain insights into various recovery-oriented systems, and learn how leaders across the country are building recovery-ready communities. The Recovery Corner podcast does not provide clinical advice.
Hi, everyone. My name is Soraya Sampson, and I serve as the Director for Strategic Equity and Inclusion for Young People in Recovery. And with us today is Ryan Hampton.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So Ryan, can you start by telling us a little bit about your own personal journey and how you became involved in recovery advocacy?
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of look back and I see myself, and I think many of us who do this work see ourselves as accidental advocates or
Yeah.
activists. I never, this was not in the cards for me, nor was it the plan. I was led into this space, into advocacy and activism and community organizing around recovery and ending overdose. As a result of my own personal journey, which included, over a decade of chaotic drug use and, many attempts at unsuccessful, treatment and barriers to accessing, hospital systems and
Yeah.
recovery houses and just the nightmare of navigating the system on your own. But at the tail end, because I try not to focus too much on the horror story, and it was pretty bad. At the tail end, I was unhoused or homeless on the streets of Los Angeles on Skid Row in 2014, and it was a public treatment facility that I had been trying to get into for over a month that finally
Wow.
said yes, that they had a bed for me on Thanksgiving Eve 2014. And they treated me with buprenorphine, which was something I never had access to before. And,
Yeah.
helped me get into a recovery house at the end of my treatment. And, when I had left treatment, my goal in going into recovery housing was just to find a job and kind of forget all this had ever happened to me, and
Yeah.
to get back into the work I had been doing a decade earlier, which was more in public policy and politics. And I didn't share my story with anyone. My mom didn't share the story with anyone. We just kind of swept it under the rug as if, the 10 years prior in my life just never happened. And my first job was I was driving Uber and just, saving some money because I was living in Southern California, and I figured
Sure.
I'd move somewhere and take another political job. And that's not what happened. I mean, I thought, when you got through with treatment and you got into housing and, we're starting to pull your life back together with what you had, that everybody around you was going to be doing the same thing. And, we had a small, tight group of friends in the recovery house. And, you just kind of assume that everything's going to be happy-go-lucky and everybody's going to be okay. And that's not what happened. A lot of friends in that first year that I had gotten sober with, and roommates of mine were dying, and they were
Yeah.
dying literally right in front of me. They were being turned away at treatment facilities and turned away at emergency rooms when they were asking for services, and they had no insurance, they had no money, they didn't know where to go. And one of my friends, Nick, early on in 2015 overdosed and died 2 blocks from our house, and we found him slumped over on the sidewalk and dead. And the response that I got when I was really angry about when Nick died. And
Yeah.
owner of the house
Understandably.
had said, this is just kind of what happens. People will die when you get into recovery, and this is just kind of what you signed up for. And just kind of like shrugged it off. And I remember thinking, that's not right. Like, I mean, I'm being told to accept that because that's just the nature of our disease. And maybe there is some truth to that, but there's also truth to the fact that Nick tried to go to the emergency room the night before and was turned away, and was told there was no bed for him, and told there was no help for him, and given, crisis hotlines that he could call if he was willing. And that was also true, and that was not right.
Yeah.
And it was at that moment that I decided maybe there was something more that I could do, because I wasn't willing to sit by and watch this happen to people that I loved. And that experience turned into this kind of journey for me of seeing who else out there felt the same way as I did. And in 2016, I that summer took a cross country trip, um, where I went with my best friend across the United States and visited other communities and saw my first recovery community organization, and
Wow.
went into treatment facilities and met with people who use drugs, and folks who were unhoused, and stayed in the homes of family members who had lost a brother or sister or a sibling or a son or a daughter
Hmm.
previous year, and just became this sponge. Went inside jails and uh, correctional facilities, and just spoke to people, and came home from that trip. And it was only supposed to be kind of a one and done experience, but just feeling so reignited that I wasn't alone, and reassured that I wasn't alone in this anger and in this frustration, and also in this hope that something could be done, because not much was being addressed at the time. And that was
Hmm.
really the birth of the Voices Project, right? That's where we started.
Hmm.
um, and it's just kind of incrementally grown over the years into something that I never could have imagined it would have become. And I think it's just become a testament to, there's many of us out there that feel the same way. And how powerful if we actually organized the recovery and drug policy space the same way that other healthcare movements have been,
Yeah.
social movements have been organized in the past, because the numbers don't lie. The numbers are on our side, right? The
Hmm.
23 million estimated people in recovery, and 1 in 3 American households that are impacted. And those numbers are only increasing. And if only a fraction of them, a small fraction, like less than 1% even of them organized, I think we could make a huge dent, um, uh, with respect to the solutions that are being offered to our communities, because they are few and far between.
Wow. Amazing. What an incredible story and just so powerful. So I'm curious, in your experience as a recovery advocate, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges and maybe misconceptions surrounding recovery that you've encountered? Maybe especially amongst policymakers, even.
So I think, one of the biggest challenges, there's been a lot of talk around stigma and
Mm,
how, addiction and overdose, it touches everyone, and everyone's impacted. And, we use new language these days, but I'd still say stigma is still the top challenge for me. And when I say stigma, I mean discrimination, I mean
mhm.
prejudice, bias, because a lot of, while someone may go in front of the microphone and say, we can't arrest our way out of this epidemic, or everyone's impacted, a lot of those same people behind closed doors are making very harmful policy decisions. And that's
Yeah,
really because, even though they toe the public line that, we've destigmatized this issue, nothing could be further from the truth when it comes to the actions they've taken and how we address the issue. I think we've seen a lot of this with some of the fentanyl policy that's come out.
yeah,
Um,
100%.
a real race to the bottom to recriminalize people who use drugs. And that's really because they see us as different, right? They see, substance use, addiction, fentanyl use as a bad decision, made by bad people. And by virtue of that, bad people do bad things. Therefore, we must incarcerate these people to rehabilitate them. So I think that while, there's certainly been a lot of rhetoric around
Mhm.
stigma bashing, I still think that we are seen differently. People who use drugs are seen differently. We are seen as a choice. It is still seen as a moral issue, not a healthcare
Mhm.
issue. So we would see a definite shift in the response, particularly in the era of fentanyl.
Yeah,
So in order to combat that, we do need to organize, and we need to organize at a very local micro level, and we need to organize at a very broad macro level. It's going to take both ends of it.
yeah, absolutely. So kind of like just doubling down on that, what uh, what role do you believe that policy and legislation might have to play when it comes to addressing, the recovery crisis that we kind of find ourselves in right now?
I think it has everything to play in it. I mean, really by just virtue of how the world runs, and the United States operates, legislation is critical, right? And good, getting good legislation out there is critical, but also combating a lot of the bad legislation is critical.
Yes, yes. I think we
I
forget that
think,
part
yeah,
sometimes.
I think the recovery space has done a fairly good job in the last 8 to 9 years, and really putting a focus on altruistic, unifying policy,
Mhm,
uh, such as programs that YPR has, right?
mhm,
Like recovery housing, treatment,
mhm.
recovery community organizations, family support services. Like these are all things that, like, it's hard to say you can't get behind them, right? And they're needed, right? But the the turning point that we've kind of entered in drug policy in 2023, and I think moving into 2024 and probably 2025, is going to be very formative, I think, for the
Mhm.
next 10, 20 years of drug policy in the United States, and have a real impact on how recovery support services that we all care about so much are delivered in our communities. And what I mean by that is, it's one thing to be supportive and forward thinking and put
Mhm.
all our eggs and energy in the basket of unifying policy that helps people. It's another thing to get vocal when it's not as popular around policy that harms people.
Yeah.
And I believe a lot of the focus of policy right now, and we're going into a very competitive and heated election season, has been harmful. We've seen a complete 180 on
Yes, we have.
folks who have, been with us shoulder to
Mhm,
shoulder on supporting recovery oriented policy, who are now proposing new legislation in many states and on a federal level that will bring, fentanyl possession down to 1 or 2 grams, and attach,
mhm,
1, 2, 3 mandatory minimums to it, along with felony convictions for folks. And
mhm.
um, it is scary, and it's scarier to see the complicity, I think, of some folks who have been allies in this space for a long time by not addressing it. Because if we don't speak up, who will? And if
Yeah.
we're not fighting and pushing back against some of these very harmful pieces of legislation, then what have we been building this movement for? Because movements aren't just about being, in agreement and singing kumbaya all the time. It's also about recognizing, you know, um, systemic prejudice, against
Mhm,
our fellow peers who either are in recovery or are using drugs, who are going to be harmed in unimaginable ways. Um, and you could pose the question like this too. At the end of the day, if we end up locking up a whole bunch of drug users, fentanyl or whatever the substance may be, and giving them felonies, you can't divorce public health from public safety. Who do you think they're
mhm.
going to come to at the end of the? Who do you think the burden is gonna fall on to help these folks when they get out of
Yeah.
prison jail? It's going to fall on us. It's going to fall on the RCOs. It's going to add a burden to us.
Mhm.
The state's not going to pick them up. They're not going to be able to find a job.
Yeah.
They're not going to be able to rent an apartment by virtue of having the felony conviction. So it also is a net benefit to us to try and not let this happen, because it's going to be a strain on our systems.
Yeah. And I think this is a topic for another day, but I think it's very important to note, and I think it often gets forgotten that once you have that felony conviction, you also don't get to vote, right? And so this is like a large group of people that like are losing out on the opportunity to kind of advocate for themselves in one of the most effective ways that we're given, right? And I think that's something we need to consider.
Absolutely.
um,
Absolutely.
Awesome, awesome. So, as an advocate, you've spoken on a lot of different platforms and engaged with a lot of different audiences. I'm just curious, what strategies do you use to effectively, really communicate this message and really talk about recovery with people who might maybe be unfamiliar or be maybe a little hesitant about the topic in general?
Yeah, I mean, probably, the one of the most effective strategies, and I learned it really as a craft during the summer of 2020 or spring of 2020 during COVID lockdown. And it has changed the dynamic of my advocacy, is really the craft of public narrative. The
Mm,
story of self, the story of us, the story of now. It's a practice that has been around for generations, and decades, and has been used, predating the civil rights movement. Um, Really, it's how do we translate our values into action? I
mhm.
think, when I came into this space newly in recovery, and I think a lot of us are in the same boat. We're pretty good at being storytellers, right? I mean,
Sure.
being, a lot of recovery pathways subscribe to storytelling is a very,
Hmm.
central focus of it. And that was no different for me. I was, very used to the format, though, of what it was like, what happened, what it's like now, right? And it's doing some of the train wreck into the moment that I got help, and how my life is today. But what's really missing from that is sometimes an emotional, connection to people who may not be,
Yeah.
in tune with recovery. And also, missing from that is that story of now. What are we asking people to do with that story,
Yeah.
right? So it's like, you could get up in front of a public, meeting, or the public square or city council meeting, and oftentimes, and I did this early on before I knew this craft, and share my story. But like, why am I sharing my story? Right? Like what am I asking my community to do? So spring of 2020, I took a 4-month class with Professor Marshall Gans over at Harvard Kennedy. He's become one of my greatest mentors and
Read a
teachers.
couple of his studies.
Yeah, in community organizing, and learned, how to do this effective, ethical storytelling when it comes to organizing. And it's really, answers a few questions. You have to ask yourself a few questions. Who are my
Hmm.
people? What is the change that they seek? And what are the resources that we need to make that happen? And I do that through sharing who I am, where my agency comes from, right?
Hmm.
What the moment was that I knew that something needed to change. What I'm asking my community to do through a very, emotional, formatted story, and asking them to be a part of the solution. And once I nailed down that craft, which is something that we really focus heavy on at Mobilize Recovery, it was a game changer in my advocacy. I saw that not only were we bringing more people into the movement in a more diverse and welcoming way, but we were also, and I was also, through this craft, um, leading people to share their stories with me, right? Feeling
Wow.
safe and comfortable, to kind of raise their hand and say, "Hey, I'm actually impacted too," even though I didn't think of it that way. And it's been fascinating to see people who are not at all attached to this space, at least self-proclaimed that they're not attached to this space or impacted by this space, to relate to the story in one way or another, whether it be through healthcare access or added
Hmm.
strain on the social systems to their community. And I really believe it's step one of community organizing. Like, if we're going to be effective organizers, we have got to learn how to tell our stories in a way that
Yeah.
has more impact. And there is, as in recovery, if we don't know something, we ask somebody else to help us. There is actually a tried and true effective method of doing this. It's been used in movement building for a long time. So why not subscribe to that?
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Awesome. So, in addition to your advocacy work, you also do a lot of, organizing and events and, initiatives. So, I know one of the big ones is an event called Mobilize Recovery, and I know it's coming up soon. So, you can tell me a little bit about it, what it is, all that good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So Mobilize Recovery was actually born in 2018. It was supposed to be a one and done meeting initiative. I was in a fellowship at Facebook under their community leadership program, and I developed Mobilize Recovery while it was incubated at Facebook while I was there, as a way of, how do we bring like-minded advocates together to develop strategies, tactics, and an agenda that we could work on together. And what were the gaps and the tools that we needed, and where could we go seek resources to fill these gaps? It was supposed to just be one meeting in July of 2019. It took about a year to organize and map out. And the thinking behind it was, I had been to the RX Summit and some of the other recovery type conferences and drug, prevention conferences, and I really felt like a fish out of water.
Sure.
There was a lot of, talking to our community from law enforcement and professionals and academics and families and prevention experts. And, I just was just, I felt very watered down when I was showing up as like, hey, I want to organize and like get shit done. Like, what do I
Yeah.
do? And like, and how do I get help with that? And that was really, kind of the goal behind Mobilize, was connecting with like-minded people who also felt that they were kind of being left behind in like the traditional kind of convening conference space. And a lot of us were. And so that was the intent of Mobilize. But coming out of Mobilize that first year, it was so empowering. It was so empowering to be with people who traditionally didn't convene in these types of spaces and had never really found a home in some of these other conference models. And Mobilize became more than an event. It became just like this year-round peer learning and peer support model for advocates and activists in the space. And we've built on that year after year. And what was supposed to be a one-year thing is now we're going into our fifth year. And it's not just focused on what the problem is, but how do we solve it? How do we work together? What are the setting, goal setting, agenda setting, assessment of tools and tactics, providing those tools and tactics, matching, local advocates and organizations with, potential partners in terms of funding and infrastructure. We don't require people to show up and be a part of an organization. We found that actually a lot of people want to, enter advocacy and activism as a representative of themselves, just a pure advocate. And so we wanted to make space for them. And I've also seen that sometimes standalone advocates can accomplish things that organizations that are funded at $10-20 million couldn't even imagine doing, just because they have such a much more personal tie, and especially when they're using crafts like public narrative. So we wanted to create a home for them, and Mobilize has become a home for them. And it's become, larger than life in the sense that we've partnered with big, bold media organizations such as iHeart. We've brought in influencers such as, Elton John and Charlemagne the God and Macklemore and others to help, Demi Lovato, elevate these messages of recovery and recovery advocacy. And I would say, I'd hope that 5 years in, we had like a defined strategic plan for Mobilize Recovery moving forward. But part of the beauty of it is we continue to fly the plane while we build it, which makes it so great. And I think that's at least in the short term, what it's going to look like moving forward. If folks were going to ask, what are you doing next year for Mobilize? I don't know.
Sure.
We let the community decide that, and we respond to them. But it's really the hope that coming out of it every year, that we're more visible as a community, we're more effective, we're seen as a valuable constituency, that we're seen as meaningful stakeholders when it comes to addressing the overdose crisis in our communities, that we're not just heard but listened to. And I mean, we saw some folks coming out of the Mobilize network last year who are running for office on recovery focused agendas. So it's really just been fascinating to see where the community's taken this.
Yeah, that's absolutely incredible. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And yeah, thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you so much, and look forward to seeing you in September for Recovery Month.
Yes, I will see you.